Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Sharing Data, Save Lives. I'm your host, I guess, Dan Rossiter, Sector Lead at the British Standards Institution. And before we start, and before I introduce the panel, I just want to go through a quick bit of housekeeping, if you don't mind. First thing for today is that this is a listen-only webinar that's being recorded, so you won't be able to unmute yourselves to join in. However, we would love your participation. To do so, you can ask questions via the Q&A function. If you've done one of these webinars before with us, you'll know exactly where you're going. If not, on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll have the GoToWebinar kind of UI toolset. As part of that, you have the opportunity to ask questions. In there, we want you to be able to, one, ask technical questions about today's webinar. And what we'll do is we have plenty of time after the presentation to deal with some of those questions. Some of you have also been kind enough to submit questions to us beforehand. I have the list of those, so we'll go through some of the pre-delivered questions and some of the live questions from today. Also, if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, for example, if you're unable to hear or if the slides aren't updating, you can use that same Q&A function to ask those questions, and someone behind the scenes will do their best to help you. If also you find this webinar useful and you'd like to share links to it to other people afterwards, once you complete the feedback survey at the end, there will be a link to the recorded webinar, which means there'll be on-demand functionality and we can share the message from today even further. That's probably enough from me from a housekeeping point of view. So what we'll do is we will introduce our speakers, and I think go straight into what we are discussing. So we have two speakers with us today. The first who's going to start us off is Gordon Crick, an inspector at the Health and Safety Executive, or the HSE. And joining him is Miranda Sharp, founder at Metis Digital. I think that if Gordon wants to introduce himself, he can probably do so. So I think, Gordon, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, BSI, and thank you for joining. It's a great pleasure to talk to you about this project, Sharing Data, Saving Lives. So I'm an inspector with the Health and Safety Executive, been a construction specialist now for many years, and most recently been leading some of the work in our Technology and Innovation Unit in our construction division around how we can move with digital technology to improve health and safety. So the Sharing Data Saving Lives project is, as it says on the tin, so the HSE, led by the HSE but funded through BAYS, a 6-month project, and we set out to research this proposition that by sharing data, and what we really mean by this is by improving risk management in the pre-construction phase, particularly sharing design risk data, we would lead to a situation where we were reducing risk on construction projects and saving lives. So we got a wonderful team working with us on this project, which completed early this year. So that was Atkins with the Open Data Institute and Metis Digital. So the HSE interest in this is very strong. Really, we were keen to look at the value of design risk management, a feeling that the pre-construction phase of a construction project holds more potential for improving risk management throughout. So we want to understand this better, and in particular, how we can understand how to help people value data risk, risk data and design risk management better. Now, we have a Discovering Safety project funded through Lloyd's Register Foundation, slightly arm's length of HSE, and it is this Discovering Safety project that actually led the Sharing Data Saving Lives project. So what we're looking to do is to share risk data between projects, programs, and employers to create something of an open learning environment to help those less experienced to learn, and all of us to learn from one another and the best practitioners in the industry. And the if you like, the big picture is that we believe that if we can share risk data, have better standardized benchmarks and so on around risk in the design phase, it's actually going to help us to, it's going to be very much in HSE's interest to help the industry to self-regulate, if you like. Just one quick slide, really, just to pin this point down. In our CDM 2015 regulations, which cover health and safety in construction, we have this very strong principle around the role of the designer, and by design a very broad definition of people, so it will include construction planners, specifiers, and people who are doing contractual stuff at the beginning of the project, all really captured within this sense of who a designer is. But what we're trying to do is to create this chain between foresight, being able to identify risk, analysing, taking into account the background, the context of that risk, taking ownership of the risk, and crucially doing something about it. So to eliminate, reduce, control and inform. So what we're looking to do is use the data, and some of the data points on the left-hand side of the slide are the data points we've used in a demonstrator in this project to demonstrate how this can be. So that, if you like, gives us the scope for this limited 6-month project. This was the scope of the area we were focusing on, if you like. And just to really ram this home, typical picture of a supply chain, if you like, in our industry. And in my experience, at least, if client A has project A, B, and C, there's some chance that those projects will not learn from one another. Now, if you then extend the supply chain further and you have these other links, what's the chances of project Z and project P benefiting from sharing data? Very limited. So what we were looking for, wanting to explore, is the potential to reverse this fragmentation and create a better environment for risk management. So by way of introduction, that's enough from me. So I'd really like to hand over to Miranda, who's going to talk on behalf of Atkins, ODI, our other partners, and introduce what we did and the more detail of the project. Thank you, Miranda.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Hello, I'm Miranda Sharp, and I work with Metis Digital and also the Open Data Institute, the ODI, and we worked with economists from Atkins last year, this year, in fact, the early part of this year, looking at how we could encourage people to share data in construction projects with the benefit of saving lives. And whilst that's a very emotive subject and a very easy case to make, there's also, and this is, we were trying to build a business case for the sharing of information so that there could be less waste in construction. I don't know how many of you have seen what I regard as a very famous McKinsey graph, which shows the degree to which different sectors are digitized. And construction comes at the bottom of that list. Well, I say at the bottom, one above agriculture and hunting. And so there's a great opportunity, we know, in the digitization of construction. And the hypothesis by work based on the work done by Gordon and others is that the waste can be addressed, and an enormous amount of that waste. There is an enormous amount of that waste. Certainly the Get It Right initiative, who we interviewed as part of that project, identified over £5 billion per annum, which happens as a result of error and rework. And that can be as much as 80% of project costs. And importantly for the HSE, 37% of accidents occur during rework. So at a time when you're already outside sort of the normal working environment, that's when people get hurt. And many of us will have seen the triangle of health and safety risk, where a serious accident often happens as a result of many minor accidents. So we're not just looking at the fatal accidents here, but how can we address all sorts of unsafe behaviours? And what we were looking at in particular was trying to find out how big this bucket was, the big waste associated with poor health and safety risk, which resulted from, which could be addressed by the sharing of data, and particularly at the construction phase, as Gordon says, when that happens, because if we address it at the construction phase, at the pre-construction phase, we can have the greatest impact. When we started looking at this work. We knew we were trying to get a handle of where all the benefits rested. And we know we've done a piece of that, and we came up with a big number. So we put the estimation in, and the drop in accidents for a 4 and 5 year period, which came from better health and safety practices, if replicated by this sort of impact, would result in an impact of nearly £200 million a year. And we know that we can hang our hat on that figure. What we can't get a measure on are the costs which are missing, which are incurred when people get hurt at work. And those are the costs of employer investigation. So if somebody's colleague gets injured, the cost that employer puts in to investigating that cost. And when I spoke to employers as part of that project, they all said that there was a gross underestimation of the impact that a serious accident at work had, so that cost is not measured and is frequently cited as the most serious element and the impact it has on people's business. The personal costs of injury and ill health, so taking people to appointments, for example, is not measured. That's a thing across the entire healthcare system. The costs of hidden rework associated with accidents, and then the more nebulous lack of client certainty and the risk of business failure, which is so often associated with a serious incident on a construction site. So we know there's an awful lot of opportunity out there. The challenge was how did we go about addressing it and building some form of business case. So the first thing we did is some work with the ODI on some work with the ODI where we engaged with the community to ask them about how they shared risks between projects, between different organisations, and what standards they used, and what confidence they had that it would go forward in the future. And the answers were quite telling. So people are relatively comfortable in their own organisational silos with their own organisational view of risks, how they talk about their risks, but they're not so confident that that can be translated into other people's organisations. So they rate the value of that information being aggregated and available at a population level higher than they rate the ability to get it done. So that's a fine example of the moral case being made, but the barriers for execution being high. And certainly our colleagues were very interested in the infrequent but catastrophic events on which we have so little data because of their infrequent nature. And it was felt that this kind of an agglomeration of data would help with the addressing of those kinds of things. But again, very difficult to do so. So what we found was that most people, when they talked about this, they were interested in some form of semi-automatic help that would act like the paperclip that you may or may not remember from Microsoft Word from many years ago, when you would start typing and say, you seem to be writing a letter. Have you thought about putting an address in the top right-hand corner? So this would be, you seem to be writing a risk register, or you seem to be digging a hole. Have you thought about the appropriate measures in place to stop people falling down it? So that was the work that the ODI did. And we use this sort of a diagram to show the problem with the barriers to execution. So everybody imagines when they think about a magic data learning machine is that this data is all abundant and easy to reach, and it can be put together very cheaply and easily, and everything will be fine at the end. So much as we might like to believe that to be true, how do we actually make it happen in practice? And how do we make it pay for itself? And it's clear, and many of the experts on this call will know that there's a lot of policy and legislative momentum making a very clear moral case for the sharing of data to stop people being harmed at work. So I've cited a few of them here. There's the Discovery Safety Programme, with which Gordon is so heavily involved, and the Building Safety Bill, and the Hackett Report and the Golden Thread Report, and even the Treasury Green Book talks about the optimism bias that takes place when assessing risk in projects. And so all of these things are saying that what a good idea And the National Data Strategy as well in particular says what a great idea it would be if we just shared data effectively so that we could learn from each other's mistakes and have equal access to what best practice looks like. During the course of this project, I was drawn to this quote from Manfred Egan about, in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. And it's not like there haven't been attempts to share and standardize information when it comes to health and safety information. As Gordon says, you know, he's been doing some work on this for some time. At a BSI webinar, I'm sure this cartoon will be familiar to many of you, where we have lots of different standards and people are doing their best to adhere and comply with them, but the risk is that they just end up creating more standards. And when we talk to colleagues as part of this research, we say, well, there's a standard exists already, why aren't you complying with it? And the answer is they were all complying with it in their own way. And actually, I found one of the most amusing findings for me was that despite all these standardized methodologies and systems, actually often the most reliable data came from information which was recorded in a manual fashion, because people had to be the most fastidious in their recording of information, and they'd settled on a nice simple system. But that just goes to illustrate how very hard it is to get this information into a standard form. And even if we think about the technology which goes behind the recording of risks and the sharing of information, when we got deep into discussions with people, we then sort of came up against this sort of three-headed dog again of the problems of sharing data. And these three difficulties, there are three heads of this dog. People were all very, the first one was privacy. So people were very nervous about sharing information because they didn't want to compromise individuals' privacies, and that's a good thing. People were worried about the security. We've seen that in the Cabinet Office sponsored Geospatial Commission project on the National Underground Asset Register, where they are looking to agglomerate information about subsurface assets. So again, so that fewer people come to harm at work. So when you're digging a trench to fix a pipe, the risk is that you cut through somebody else's cable. But the security risk associated with bringing all that information together is that it's much easier to work out where bad actors, it's much easier for bad actors to work out where they might interfere with the system in order to elicit the most harm. And therefore, the physical security aspects of sharing information is often a barrier to people sharing it as openly as they might do. And then finally, the burden of commercial liability. There's two sides to this argument. If I share my data and you make an enormous amount of money out of it, I'm going to look very, very silly. And therefore people are sometimes worried, they hold their data, they hoard it. And in other examples, I might share my data with all good intention, but I'm unaware of the flaws in it, which you might find. And as a result, you might come back after me and try and pursue me for the loss of for losses incurred as a result of looking at that poor quality data. And these three problems, these sort of risk eye views of the problems with sharing data, often mean that people who are in principle very happy and delighted to comply with the moral arguments of sharing information, in practice have got some very good reasons why not this data and not their data and not at this particular time. And these are significant problems we found when we were trying to get people to share information, and they talked about the challenges of sharing information in the past. Now, I don't have answers to all of those, unfortunately, but I can tell you that work is ongoing with the Open Data Institute and other places to address what defined mechanisms so that people are able to address these concerns. But that's not all. So it's not just the technology, it's not just these problems of privacy, security and commercial liability. As we said at the beginning, it's often the business case. And if we have this excellent repository or network way of sharing information so that people can get out the other side and get a good view of data. What are the business case elements that we need to bring together? So some of the costs are relatively easy to identify. If we are going to curate, if we're going to have a way of comparing data and compiling the data into a population level level set of data that from which we can draw insight, we're going to need to be effort put in around getting that data ready and submitting it, both before and after project. So what risks did you identify before the project, and what risks did or did not happen? What mitigations did you put in place, and which ones were effective? Which ones were more effective than others? So all that gathering of information and providing it has some effort, and the curation and analysis, as I've alluded to before, is also significant. So people understand there's going to be value, but they just, for all sorts of reasons, they don't understand. They worry about how that curation and standardization can be brought together in order to do enough useful things. But on the other side of the scales are the benefits and the beneficiaries. And people can talk quite eloquently about the possibility of a system which isn't paper-based, which means that they know what they can easily access information on what the statutory requirements are on risks and mitigation, but also on what best practice might be, or what even compliant might be, or things that, or highlighting risks of which they're unaware. So people are sort of grateful for that kind of thing happening, and they imagine that it will create value for them. And then the HSE is very interested at looking, and others is interested in looking at the population activity, so a population-wide activity. So where do most accidents happen? When do they happen? And what is the impact? And what were the failed mitigations, or indeed the successful mitigations? And that population level insight benefits both employers and society with better delivered outcomes in construction. And less contingency, less risk built into the business case. And actually, one of the other sort of hidden benefits that we found when we talked about this was advice on data interoperability, security, and privacy. Precisely that thing I talked about in the previous slide. People want to get around those problems, but how do you stop the negative aspect of that risk being front and centre of people's minds? So with the help of our colleagues at Atkins, we put together this logic model for where are the benefits, what do we want to do, what do we want to happen as a result, and who benefits. And the first thing to say about this logic model is that we discovered that the benefits were sort of distributed across a range of people. So the employers are going to benefit from the increased productivity associated with fewer accidents. They're going to be the principal beneficiary of that, but then also workers and families are going to benefit from less societal ill health. And that's the easiest one to sort of describe and see, but there's also evidence that good health and safety practices infer something we called a positive moral glow on organisations and groups of people. So when organisations take health and safety seriously, there is some evidence that they are more efficient as businesses, and that they incur not only the fewer costs associated with accidents, but they incur other benefits and things around access to greater opportunity, and some evidence, although the insurance market is not perfect, of lower costs of insurance from having good demonstrable health and safety practices, which might, for example, when we talk to the insurers, result in lower training costs and higher institutional memory, and therefore more productivity. And then finally, the other sort of big benefit and outcome we identified was this decreased business friction. So when dealing with somebody who is at the opposite end of a good health and safety risk manager, somebody who has a poor reputation, will have access to less less opportunity. They may incur more friction with lawyers and contractors who want to be absolutely sure that in this instance the people associated with poor reputation are not going to have bad outcomes. And this decreased friction we think might materialize as workforces which are skilled not only in health and safety management, but also in risk mitigation. And there's some evidence that this could contribute to sort of an upskilling and increase in productivity. Now, some evidence and increased productivity measures, although attractive, we didn't put into the business case. We can identify them, but because we're not talking about a logic model where we can say, if we do this, then these fewer meetings will happen, people have to fill in these fewer forms. This is still quite a tenuous logic model, and one that will require significant future testing. In order to stand up substantially. But I think the thing we can be clear on is that creating an evidence base from which which everybody can learn, and that's not just the big companies who already have quite sophisticated and siloed, as I said before, health and safety systems, but we can also allow innovators to come into the marketplace and have access to information about risks and how they're mitigated and the outcomes associated with them. And so this is about leveling the playing field and increasing the number of people who can engage with health and safety risk information, so that these outcomes, these benefits, which are currently scattered and therefore not measured and difficult to balance against the costs, and how we can bring it all together. So this is the work that we did in the project, and as we've gone on to do more work with the ODI, I started using this diagram to describe how actually when we think about how the data economy in general and the sharing of risk information in construction might support better outcomes, what we're talking about is trustworthy data, so data that people can use and can be confident about its provenance, flowing in well-governed ways. So that means it's easily interoperable, it can be seen by other people, and without those risks of privacy, commercial liability, and security, and in a data ecosystem. Now, this is quite a utopian view of where we might like to get to, and I certainly don't think we'll get there in one bound. But certainly we feel that every step we take towards this trustworthy data flowing in well-governed ways around a data ecosystem is a step worth taking, and very much a step worth learning from. So that's the work that we did as part of this project. Oh, sorry, I've got that one. So if I can leave you with, if you remember nothing else from what I've said, is that we could see an enormous drop in the costs associated with health and safety incidents were we to share information and were we to find a way to address those barriers, but it's not just all about the money. So that's it for me. I look forward to answering your questions later on, but I'm now going to hand back to Gordon, who's going to talk about next steps.
Thank you very much, Miranda. That was great. So the project, we did a lot of work looking at the foundations of the business case. We did a certain amount of work looking at the practicalities of how to share data. We drew on the Discovering Safety project to create something with a limited demonstrator, so we could begin to see how we might share risk data. But the one thing that we were left with was a real sense that this is not an easy problem to solve, and the idea that there are some real cultural issues, and this was illustrated perhaps for me in a real tension between people, typically health and safety practitioners, engineers, people who would say, well, there should be no IP in safety, there should be no secrets in safety. Of course, it's in everybody's interest to share what we do. And I think most people who work in construction realize that although construction contractors have unique ways of doing things, actually they are doing similar tasks, using similar tools to achieve similar ends. And the aspects of that which keep workers safe, there really is a strong argument that we should share information around that. But there's a contrast between that kind of really healthy, for me, response and the more guarded and nuanced response when it actually push comes to shove and we say, well, now come on, share us some data, share us with a risk register from your project. And this octagon was a way of putting these issues together in one diagram, if you like. And of course, these aren't all cultural issues. So you can look at things like security, data quality, data tools, data standardization. And you think, well, those are the practical things. But these practical aspects can be blockers or can be enablers, because if you want to be risk averse, then one of the easiest cards to play is this: oh, my data's not secure, I couldn't possibly share it. So it's what we need to do is get to this right balance, I think, in the industry, where we understand what the balance is between, on the one hand, the desire to share data and these issues that arise, and tools actually of standardization aggregation that will enable us to do it. But there's one, I think, cultural issue which, when we discussed this, we felt really overshadowed all the rest, and it is this question of how does the industry value design risk data and the value of design risk management at the early stage of the project. And it's a real interesting question. And I suppose what we'll be looking to do, we're looking to send a message to clients and others to say, well, look, have you thought about investing more heavily, valuing more highly what could be achieved earlier in projects if modern digital techniques are used to design and to use risk data better in order to visualize risks and manage them. And I think that's, if you like, our underlying message is that we're looking for a greater valuing of this process of understanding design risk data and an investment in it, actually, in order to achieve the outcomes which we all want, which is during the construction phase to ensure that there's less uncertainty, less risk, better construction processes, fewer people exposed to dangerous situations. So out of the report, the kind of things we want to see happening are simplification and alignment of data, very important first steps. And this is where the Discovering Safety is working, Discovering Safety process working with our construction risk library to standardize how we describe risk, and aligning that with Uniclass, we hope. That's something we hope to do fairly soon. To take lessons from other industries who are doing this perhaps better than us. Now, generalization is a great way. For me, this is a process where data or risk scenarios or risk and health safety information can be brought to a level of generalization where it's no longer commercially in confidence, it's no longer project in confidence, but it can be shared with the wider industry. And if information can be generalized, there's an enormous amount of learning that we can get from that generalized information. So at the most basic level, generalization, I think, is a really important idea and something that we all need to be looking at doing. And alongside that, better tools, auditing and benchmarking in the design phase. I think something I've been talking to colleagues in HSE about really is how can we encourage and promote data sharing. And one of the ideas was, well, should we be auditing more heavily at the design stage to make sure that the right data is being used on projects. And of course, we want to see case studies. So the next steps, we have a report. We'll hopefully be able to promote this with the slides from this presentation. We want to explore the areas of benefit that Miranda went through, get across this message about valuing design risk management, valuing the early involvement of contractors and health and safety specialists. I wonder how many of you have health and safety specialists involved in procurement processes. So it's always been a bit of a mystery to me is how you can price something properly without understanding the risks that might be present in that design. But short term, we're looking to develop this work through Discovering Safety further. We have put in another bid to the BEIS RPF project, Regulatory Pioneers Fund project. So we're waiting to hear whether we'll be successful with that. And long term, to work with others in the industry to look at what the options are for leadership and sustainability, how to share data. So I think that's enough from us. It's going to be really interesting now to have a panel discussion and take your questions.
No, that was brilliant. Thank you very much, Gordon. And Miranda, oh, there you are. You're already joining in before us. Brilliant. So as we discussed, we have got some questions coming in. So thank you, and feel free to keep putting your questions through. What I'll do is I'll start with one of the questions that's been raised during the presentation from Adrian. And I think some of the conversations that are coming through is around awareness to the true principles of the CDM regs. And I think interestingly, through the presentation itself there, we had a wealth of benefits that you could see for various actors. It seemed not to call it a no-brainer, but there were some obvious no-brainer elements of reducing the cost of relating to health and safety incidents, all these other things. But because you've still got that cultural aspect as a barrier to it, is potentially that kind of greater awareness around its relationship to supporting CDM from that kind of, hang on, there's regulatory requirements on this is how it's doing it, and actually how is the best way to do that, and is that the right route, and what's industry's role in that, perhaps. And I don't know, Gordon, if you wanted to start with that as our HSE person.
Yeah, thank you. I think CDM is an important starting place. And of course, in conventional health and safety terms, a nice model of CDM is the model that actually puts the worker at the center of everything, because that's who you're trying to protect. And I suppose from that, you can build out in layers. So we are looking to contractors and designers to help us raise awareness, but also to explore it within their own businesses, actually. I'm not sure how well businesses share data even between projects for the benefit of one project at each end of the country. So I think there's a lot to be done and a lot to be learned. But beyond the design phase and reaching out into the inception phases of projects, and we bring in interesting drivers with net zero, with BSR, with modern methods of construction, and you realize the need for discussions early on to optioneer and for health and safety to be at the heart of that, because you can often find solutions which bring the best of all worlds together, which you wouldn't necessarily have thought about if you had just gone down a sort of a straightforward build, envision a design, build a design kind of process. So that's, yeah, that'll be my comment.
Fab, have you got anything to add to that, Miranda? I can't hear you at the moment.
Are you
Sorry, I have unmuted. I wouldn't. Gordon's the expert in this area. The one thing I would note, and something I learned last week, is that standards which are implementable purely by the technical community, sometimes, whilst they might be easy to implement, sometimes miss the opportunity to affect change, particularly in sort of policy or managerial decisions, by requiring people to think differently about a process or some information. But of course, that's harder. So I think we've engineered a very wicked problem in which there are a number of stakeholders and beneficiaries when it comes to sharing information about risk. which might mean that when and if we crack it, the benefits will be significant.
No, thank you. And I think it's worth pointing out as well, sort of related to this question, very recently on the UK BIM framework, we've had a new paper go up as well on doing CDM digitally as well, which is a very useful resource. And I've asked kindly that the link be put in the chat and that people can have a look at that. And you know, it is quite an important bit, is that relationship, and it's flabbergasting at times how people don't even know their own roles as part of CDM or otherwise as well. Interestingly, moving on, I have two questions that appear potentially diametrically opposed, which I think is great for a discussion panel. The first one was a pre-submitted question, which was asking about having a library of risks and whether that's a good idea. And then the opposing view that's come through from Ian is about, surely what we're trying to do is deal with non-standard risks. And that actually, surely what we're trying to do is eliminate risks that a competent contractor ought not deal with the ones that competence ought to sort of deal with. And I remind myself back when I did my IOS training on this idea that you don't need to tell someone that bricks are hard and glass is sharp. So I wondered, what were your views on, is it about all risks? Is it about weird non-standard risks? How do we line this up right? And I guess maybe to start with, Miranda, how did the project deal with it from a scoping point of view, and what was the breadth of the risks being dealt with?
Oh, that's a wicked question, isn't it? So my answer is we've got to take a data-led approach. You've got to look at both the impact you can have, and addressing common risks clearly does a great deal of good, and in theory should be addressable, but therefore a risk library is a very good idea, as is a library of ameliorating actions and mitigations, and absolutely should be invested in. But then the tackling of non-standard, difficult risks, if we could have avoided something like the pandemic, if we could address in advance something like the impact of climate change, there is a huge benefit to be had. But it's about when you're going to take your benefits, and you need to do some of the stuff that addresses common activity, and see the benefit in common accidents reducing, in order to build confidence that you can address some of those harder, thorny blue swans that are going to come down the pipe. And so I think we should always aspire to tackle those sort of infrequent catastrophic events, but I recognise that they're a slightly different skill set to the regular events which happen around slips, trips and falls. But again, I'm interested to know what Gordon says to that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I've changed my tune on this a little bit since getting immersed in digital tools, because I think, honestly, the digital world offers us ways of communicating and transmitting and receiving, actually, information about risk, which simply weren't possible in the world of documents and guidance books from HSE. So I actually want to have my cake and eat it now, because my perception now of a construction project is that there will be an enormous amount of work done in the design team, and some of that's done by CAD technicians, by juniors, even overseas. And what everybody expects, is for that work to do the routine stuff well. So at a routine level, I want risks ironed out as a matter of the job. It's nothing special to do that, and to iron out those risks. And with digital tools, it makes it possible to look at detail far earlier in the project and in far more depth. And of course, what you need with that is a very strong escalation process, so that in PAS 11026 we used the word elevated risk rather than significant, because we were looking for a machine operable definition to work with digital tools. So we're looking for an escalation process, so that if the CAD technician sees a problem that's out of his scope, he can escalate it, and then it can be taken to the principal designer, to the specialists, for third-party scrutiny, whatever. But I want to have my cake and eat it. I want to see design projects actually doing both. The risk library, I agree to an extent. It could be taking the discretion away from individual designers if you really pushed it to its limits. But look at it the other way, and I think there's a huge benefit also in the sense that consultants, charge an awful lot of money. There's an overhead cost sometimes for information which actually should be readily available. And actually, if you looked hard enough, it jolly well is. So if we can surface some of this basic stuff in a risk library, so that it's accessible to every level of the industry, and that includes the small regional builders or somebody who's working on a mobile phone, then that is a really valuable thing to do. And that risk library can be as detailed. It can include what you need to do to meet, building control as well as health and safety standards. So I'm quite in favour of a digital library, risk library developing. So sorry, Dan, a bit of a lengthy answer possibly.
No, that's all right. It's been helpful because we've had some reactions in the question box as well, which I think almost allows a real-time discussion, which I think is great. So, for example, I think Catherine's come back on this idea of risk library as part of it, and one of the points being raised here is that there's a risk with risk libraries. I could have worded that better, I think, that they might just get applied wholesale onto a project without adapting them to suit conditions, location, effectively adding context. But I think it sounds like what we're saying is that with the appropriate application, they could be a powerful tool. But I think it's probably important to recognise that while the same incident could occur on multiple projects, it won't be the same risk because the context will be different each time. And I wonder whether there's scope for good practice or some sort of support or guidance for someone if they were to do risk libraries on the sort of things that should be included wholesale and things that should be project specific in that way. I think I see Miranda's nodding along, but I guess how does that factor into your view on risk libraries, Gordon?
Yeah, well, it's a new idea, isn't it? So I mean, I agree. There could be unforeseen circumstance, unforeseen consequence. Of course, there could be. But I'm really interested in, if you like, the smaller end of the industry and how we can help people who, at the moment, don't have very much information at all about risk. So I kind of would like to see us stepping forward. Quite significantly, but being careful at the same time to weigh up what these consequences are. And of course, the professional bodies, as yet, the ICEs and our, REBAs of this world, haven't got engaged with this in a significant way. So it's really important, that it needs to be a rounded approach from the industry to develop such a library if it was to take off.
No, that's interesting. I guess fitting into some of the other bits that we've seen, and going back to some of our pre-submitted questions, because we're now talking about that kind of data and data sharing bit. I think, considering I've got you here, Miranda, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about how digital twins might fit into all this, particularly as I imagine that the sharing between projects or even between organisations would include risk information.
One would hope so. I wanted to add to Gordon's answer there. The people who oppose the sharing of automated generated tools might, well, no, like you, I could have put this better, wouldn't have started from here. The risk of not using risk libraries might be greater than some people using them badly. And so if we can affect some positive change through risk libraries, but more positive change by the nuanced use and the intelligent use, then that's indeed what we should be aiming. So it should be like using outputs of AI. We shouldn't be using them unthinkingly. We should be using them to prompt further thoughts and discussion. Right, anyway, sorry, now I've got that off my chest. So how does this affect digital twins, or how can we use this for digital twins? Well, the Gemini principles, which were launched about 3 or 4 years ago now, talk about digital twins must have purpose, trust and function. and certainly a purpose of a digital twin could be to reduce risks in construction, and therefore this is an excellent example of a use to which digital twin should be put. But when I think about digital twins, the case for isolated digital twins is relatively simple to make. In that we can use our digital twin of our wind turbine or whatever asset we have to understand how it performs in different scenarios, or to enable people to train on it in a virtual environment, rather than, for example, sending them up a wind turbine to do maintenance. And those benefits are well captured, and that's why digital twins are sort of booming. But there are further and greater benefits to be garnered when we connect digital twins. So if we connect everybody's risk systems, if we connect the multiple use of a road, then we're going to get a much better travelling experience, where if we would collect all the information about a road so that people avoid the accidents, but also maintenance is carried out to the most efficient schedule. And in the same way, we'll get the most benefit if everybody puts their information about health and safety together, so that we can get population level insight and learn more quickly and from each other, and at the risk of fewer people, if it can be brought together. So I think that this is an example of a digital twin, and it may just be a component of it, but we should be using the tools, techniques, language and examples of digital twin, and we are when we're doing this research, when we are building, when we're doing further research and building a risk sharing mechanism for construction companies.
No, fab. Thank you very much. We are getting closer to time at the moment, and interestingly, the Q&A is focusing quite hard on this of risk libraries. So I think there'll be an interesting conversation, maybe offline, perhaps afterwards, Gordon, about whether there's maybe something needs to be done around good practice around risk libraries. But at the moment, I can see there's a float there. There's a desire for guidance, or at least more signposting around how this might relate to pre-construction information, and the way that's developed, and that proper use of the sort of risk libraries. But what I'll do is I'll ask you both, mostly because these are commentary, I think, now, as opposed to questions. What I'll give you both is an opportunity to maybe just to sum up with a final thought or a call to action that you'd like the audience to look at. And I'll ramble slightly so you can collect your thoughts whilst I ramble. So if people are interested in trying to improve how they share risk information in their projects, or even from an organizational point of view more generally, what piece of advice would you give them, and where might you point them to in the first instance? And I imagine, Gordon, I might start with yourself.
Yeah, the Discovering Safety project is a good place to start. We've just written a position paper on risk scenarios, which would be interesting. What we see in the risk library, in our Discovering Safety risk library, of two parts, if you like. One is the part which describes the risk scenario, describes the problem. And what we've very much focused on there is relating data to a model. So in the digital world, what we're trying to do in health and safety, or sort of what I'm trying to do, is as far as possible make documents, which is the stuff of health and safety, the narrative text document, to make that talk to spreadsheets and coded information, and then make that again talk to a model, so you can get those three sources of information. But so the risk scenario piece, I think, can be pictures, illustrations, really helpful, attached to a screenshot from a model with data attached, which can then have further references if you wanted to. So the risk scenario piece, to an extent, as a first step, but then the second step is the crucial one of what do you do about it. And I think there's loads of creativity and potential for, at the moment in our risk library, we only express treatment as a prompt. So it's only a single phrase or sentence designed to make a designer think. We haven't gone further than that, but there is loads of scope to think, well, should I standardize treatments across my business? Can I actually work out costs and benefits of treatments so that I can work out which treatments I actually should be using across a range of projects? In what circumstances does one system, should I be pushing designers one way or another way? So I think there's lots of work to be done. And I don't think it's just a library, an encyclopedia, which you look up. There's a process here about how you work through the problem as well, which is an integral part of a risk library as well. So, come, I guess, contact Discovering Safety and talk to us about the risk library. That would be very good.
Thank you. And Miranda, your final thoughts and call to action.
Yeah, well, I think you'll have quite a few people then if the chat's ablaze with people about talking about risk libraries. So the Digital Twin Hub is always a fantastic place to start to learn about the challenges of sharing data and creating digital twins, of which this is an example. So don't be frightened about whether or not you think it's a digital twin. There's a buzzing community out there who wants to talk about this kind of thing. And come and talk to us at the ODI about how we can make data work for everyone. If Gordon is absolutely the expert on this field in particular, but if you're thinking wider and want some other advice or other people to talk to or articles and research that we can point you at, come and talk to the ODI or seek me out, and I'll be more than happy to engage with you about the challenges of valuing data and making it work for everyone.
No, brilliant. Thank you both. So what we'll do is we'll thank both our speakers, Gordon and Miranda. Thank you very much. You can jump off now, and I think I've got a summing up slide of that's all right. Thank you very much for coming. And what I'll just make a quick note is that we have these as a series of webinars. As we mentioned, they get on demand as well. So if you want to share this webinar, and hopefully you do, you'll be able to get access to it afterwards. And just know that our next virtual webinar is on the 29th of November, where we're looking at updates around approved document B. And then, quite excitingly, we have got our Global Built Environment Congress at the end of the year, which are 4 half-day seminars looking at various different topics. As you can see them written down there. So we're starting with health, safety and well-being on the morning of the 30th. I myself am hosting cyber physical infrastructure in the afternoon. And then on the 1st of December, we have quality and value management, finishing off with modern methods of construction. So these are 4 separate, distinct half-day sort of sessions, if you like, with their own array of speakers, various bits and pieces. So please do have a look at those. As with all these events, they are free to attend, they are virtual, and hopefully you will find them well worth attending. And any more information you'd like around things we're after and some of the events we're putting on, feel free to go to the links that you can see on the slide as well. That being said, I think that's all of it from me. So I'll just say thank you very much for attending. I hope you found it interesting, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you.